Hello everyone, tonight let's walk through a city shrouded in fog and coal, where the past breathes slowly beneath the soot of the chimneys. Imagine a place where the sound of footsteps mixes with the clicking of the hooves of tired horses, where the smell of burnt bread is lost in the humid air, and where night falls before the sun has even finished setting. This is not a story to be rushed. It is a story to be heard with your eyes closed, perhaps with a blanket over your shoulders, as if listening to an ancient secret coming from the other side of history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from? What is your time right now? I always imagine this silent world of people listening to stories in so many different time zones. Now, close the day window. Turn off the notifications in your mind and get ready to calmly cross time. Imagine yourself walking through the alleys of London in the mid-19th century. Not that London of royal stories with thrones and balls, but the other one. The smoke, the one with the leaks, the one about the 7 souls that share a single mattress. The city that breathes heavily, as if each street carried its own worn-out lungs. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. On certain nights, when the silence of my house is as thick as the fog of a dream, I am reminded of Victorian London. It comes not as a place, but as a slow, sick sigh. A city where the air itself seemed to weigh on your shoulders. Imagine waking up not to a ray of sunshine, but to the breath of an invisible furnace. The smoke from 1,000 coal stoves rising from the chimneys, covering the sky with a grey that was confused with sadness. People walked in a hurry, but not because of the modern routine. It was the cold, it was the hunger, it was the fear that time would stop and leave him there, frozen between the cracks in the pavement and the murmur of a fish vendor. The houses were made of brick, but there was no heat in. The narrow hallways felt like tight lungs. When the wind blew, it wasn't a breeze, it was a threat. And even inside the house, the darkness seemed to prefer to stay. The gas lamps cast shadows that hid more than they revealed. Every inch of that space seemed to have been designed to remind people that comfort was a luxury. And luxury, a distant daydream. The floor creaked not from age, but from anguish, as if silently protesting against the weight of those who stepped on it without choice. London was a living but tired organism, and each neighborhood seemed like a different part of a sick body. The veins were the damp alleys, the organs were the factories carving smoke, and the eyes, perhaps they were the dark alleys, always watching in silence. One did not walk lightly there. Every step was a risk, every corner a question, and there were as many silent screams behind the windows as on the sidewalk. Children did not play, laughter did not echo, and if a song emerged, it came from a drunken throat, heavy with dust and longing. Our modern gaze may find this density strange, but the past does not ask us to judge. It only listens. It was a city where dreams were not born, but only endured, where hope was kept alive not by promises, but by small gestures. A piece of bread shared, a hand helping to lift a heavy crate, the sound of a poorly tuned flute playing in the streets, and sometimes that was all it took. Because in that tired London, even the most subtle breath of beauty became urgent. It's funny to think how some places seem to have been made for rest, and others, like Victorian London, for weariness. And yet, there were those who called that place home, those who saw beauty in the dirty lace of the curtain, or in the smoke that danced between the rooftops. The city could suffocate, but it was also stubborn. It survived under its own weight, under its own shadows, and that's why, even in the midst of what seemed like an urban hell, there were traces of sky. A dirty sky, perhaps, but still, sky. Sometimes I wonder how many lives could fit inside that city. How many stories were told between sips of reheated tea and letters never sent. The past is made of details, of small particles of dust that remain floating between the centuries. And when we visit a time like that, we are not looking for greatness. We are looking for humanity. Victorian London is not just a heavy memory. It is an invitation to look gently, to listen to what it still has to whisper through the cracks of memory. The day began early, not because the body was rested, but because the silence of dawn gave way to the first sounds of survival. A push here, a creak there, bare feet meeting the cold floor. And when he opened his eyes, the ceiling dripped with memories of a night that was never comfortable. It was there, in a single room with peeling walls, that 7 people lived, sometimes more. A couple with children, a sick uncle, a neighbor with nowhere to stay. There were no separate beds. There were mattresses that looked like wet rags, and a privacy that existed only in thought. The walls, when they were not damp, bore the marks of other times. A child's drawing made with charcoal, an oil stain that was once soup. The rats did not hide. They moved around freely, as if they also lived there. as if they were part of the improvised furniture made from boxes and loose boards. The bathroom, if it existed, was shared with dozens of neighbors, but most common was the complete absence of any plumbing. Buckets, rakes, and open windows took care of hygiene with the same dignity that the city seemed to deny. There was no kitchen. There was a dark corner with a stove, sometimes not even that. Breakfast arrived as soon as it could. Hard, dry bread that crackled in the teeth like a reminder that time passes and does not improve. If there was porridge, it was cause for silent celebration. But even the ingredients were fought over by the rats. And tea, always hot, was not a taste choice, but a safety necessity. The water needed to boil so as not to get sick. It was the only way to feign care amid structural neglect. The street outside offered no relief. The air dense seemed to contain more coal than oxygen. The London fog, known as the pea souper, was not as romantic as in the stories. It was toxic. It made eyes burn, noses bleed, clothes smell of soot. And yet, children ran between the carts, trying to avoid the waste, the horses, the wheels that wouldn't stop. Many coughed like old people. Some were born with worn-out lungs. It was the kind of childhood that started late and ended too soon. The adults moved like hurried shadows. Some carried empty bags, some pulled barrels, some just walked, as if walking was a form of resistance. The mud stuck to the shoes, and when it dried, it seemed to become part of the skin. The sound of the carts mingled with the clamour of the distant churches, and in the midst of all this, music could still be heard. A whistle here, a hoarse song there, because even where everything seems to be falling apart, the human soul finds a note to balance itself. As the afternoon wore on, the common room filled up again. Bodies that had been exposed to the day returned to the small nocturnal refuge. They washed their faces in shared basins. They took sweaty coins and crumbs from their pockets, and they tried, with what little they had, to simulate a dinner. It was at these times that the silence weighed most heavily. When you heard your neighbors crying or fighting, when you heard each other's stomachs growling, and there was nothing you could do. And even then, people slept, because sleep there was also an escape, and the next day would be the same. But no one talked about it. Words were saved as much as bread. And even in this hard life, there was beauty. A girl carefully combing her sister's hair. A man patiently mending a shoe. A lady lighting a candle as if she were igniting hope. Victorian London was a place where living was painful, but where every gesture of care was an intimate miracle. As if, in the midst of so much chaos, there was still a space where tenderness insisted on living. The morning was barely light and footsteps already echoed through the wet alleys. The men walked as if they were part of the sidewalk, hunched over, slow, silent. They entered the factories before the sun rose and left long after it had set. 12 hours was the minimum. 16 was common, and all of this 6 days a week. Inside those dark brick structures, the noises were constant and dry. The hammering of metal, the screeching of gears, the screams muffled by smoke and dust. Breathing there was an act of resistance. Survival was a daily miracle. Calloused hands, cut fingers, clothes stained by grease and sweat. The factories offered no rest, no protection. If someone got hurt, they just had to tie a cloth around them and move on. Because downtime meant lost wages, the bodies functioned as extensions of the machines, and the machines waited for no one. When factory work was lacking, there was always another kind of burden waiting. Bricks stacked on the back, bags of coal on fragile shoulders, cargo on the dock, wet from rain and sea, being loaded without hesitation. Women had a different kind of struggle. Inside the homes of the wealthy, their hands became invisible. They sewed, washed, swept, cooked, all for pennies, for scraps, for vague promises of stability. Some were seamstresses in small, suffocating rooms surrounded by fabrics they would never wear. Others handled matches in factories where the air was filled with poison. White phosphorus corroded bones over time. And when the pain came, there was no remedy but silence. There was no help. There was only acceptance. When all else failed, the body became currency. Prostitution was as common as stale bread. There was no judgment. There was necessity, often tolerated by the police themselves. It was an almost institutional practice. Young women, mothers, widows, all knew their way around the streets where looks were worth a few coins. There was sadness, of course, but there was also strength in those who continued to wake up the next day, put on their torn shoes and walk again wherever life took them. Children were not left out of this cycle. At the age of 5, they were already considered fit for work. Some cleaned chimneys, where they crawled like shadows among the soot. Others collected rubbish on the banks of the Thames, among dead fish and broken glass. There were also those who made matches or rubbed cigarettes. Their small, agile and fragile fingers were ideal for the most delicate task. But each task came with a risk. and many of these risks did not leave visible marks, only absences. There were so many deaths that they no longer caused shock. An accident here, a fever there, a disappearance. That was how it was. Part of everyday life. The names of children were erased from the records, but not from the eyes of those who survived. There was an emptiness in the eyes of many mothers, as if part of them had remained inside the chimney or at the bottom of the river. But there was also a silent courage, a will to carry on, even when the world seemed made of weariness and cold. And despite everything, the hands of these people built a city. Not palaces, but roads. Not monuments, but gestures. This is the London that pulsates beneath the official history. The one where work was an imposed burden, but also a way of saying I exist. Where even the smallest effort, repeated day after day, left traces in the city's memory. A city that, even today, carries the echoes of those hurried steps and those deep sighs. Sometimes it was difficult to know where fatigue began and illness ended. In Victorian London, health was not a given. It was a bet. The air brought more than moisture and soot. He also had tuberculosis, which was hidden in every dry cough. Cholera peeked through the buckets of water, while typhoid fever walked with the effluent. The city was like a large sick organism, breathing in subs and exhaling suffering. And the people, its inhabitants, tried to balance themselves on this unstable ground with the lightness that misery allows. The water came from the Thames, but the Thames was also the sewer. Everything was thrown into it. Leftovers, waste, dead animals, broken promises. And when thirst struck, it was from there that the buckets came. Filter it, boil it. It was a luxury. The most common thing was to drink it quickly, without thinking. Or boil it and hope that the taste of rust and rot wouldn't be so strong. The whole city seemed to revolve around this cycle of contamination. And with each new outbreak, death stalked the poorest neighborhoods like someone who knows all the shortcuts. Hospitals existed, but not as we imagine. They were places where hope went to be put to sleep. There were no gloves. There were no antiseptics. And anesthesia, when it existed, was laudanum, a mixture of alcohol and opium. The same substance that was sold in pharmacies in pretty bottles as if it were a tonic. Laudanum was the cure for everything, for headaches, for cramps, for broken hearts. It was also the escape, the numbing of a greater pain, and many didn't wake up. Baths were rare, not for lack of desire, but for lack of means. Water was scarce, and when there was, it was shared, one bucket for many. The same liquid to wash the body, clothes, and pan. The basins were in a corner of the room, and everyone knew that there, more than water, there was history, and smell, and patience. Soaps, when they existed, were homemade, hard, dark, rough. But even so, there were those who took care of their hair, their teeth, as if staying clean were a gesture of intimate resistance. On colder nights, the sounds changed. The dry cough of the old men mingled with the muffled groans. Someone always had a fever. Someone always needed a cold cloth, a tea, some silence. The children who were fragile quickly fell ill, and the remedies, if they didn't come from the healer, came from faith. A lit candle, a prayer, a story repeated in the air, to deceive the pain. It wasn't medicine, it was tenderness, and often that was all that could be offered. Even so, there was hope. It hid in the open windows, in the attentive eyes, in the hands that brought hot broth. It was common to see neighbors exchanging soups, sharing leaves, improvising bandages. The community, even when wounded, still breathed solidarity. And in each house where disease took hold, there was also someone willing to care. There were no protocols, but there was affection. There was humanity. A tired, sick, but pulsating humanity. Today, when we wash our hands in clean taps, when we take a hot shower without effort, we may not think about these lives, but they existed. And it was they who, with each gesture, each precarious care, each improbable cure, built the basis of what we now call public health. Victorian London was a field of invisible battles, and its heroes anonymous. They did not wield swords. They carried buckets, basins, and hugs. And that, perhaps, was more transformative than any great achievement. Not all crime is born of greed. Some are born of hunger, others of the cold, and many of the simple will to continue existing. In Victorian London, crime was often a reflection of the city that suffocated its residents. When everything was scarce, every opportunity became a diversion. Pickpocketing was not a talent, but survival training. Children's small hands slipped into the pockets of the unsuspecting, not out of malice, but because there were mouths waiting for crumbs at home. And every coin taken was a slice of a hunger-free night. Counterfeiters mixed flour with soap to make cheese. They dyed fabrics with tea to make them look new. They sold objects that would never work, with a tired smile and a disguised hope. There was no manual for cheating the system. There was need, and a keen sense of what the other wanted to hear. It was the theatre of everyday life, and everyone, in some way, participated in the performance, sometimes as victims, sometimes as protagonists, but almost never as judges. At the fairs, it was common to find bottles of miraculous cures, tonics that promised vigor, youth, eternal love. They were nothing more than mixtures of alcohol, water, and herbs. But buying them was like buying a little liquid hope. The sellers knew this, and that's why they spoke with poetry. They used beautiful words to camouflage the harsh reality. And the customers, even if suspicious, bought them. Because sometimes a well-told lie was more comforting than the harsh truth. Prostitution was a street without signs, but with well-known paths. There was no glamour. There were downcast eyes, dry lips, worn-out dresses. Some women came from the countryside, promised jobs that never existed. Others had been wives, mothers, daughters. All were now survivors. Their bodies became instruments of negotiation in a city that offered little. And even in this hard life, there were codes, loyalties, even friendship. And yes, there was also pain. But it was a familiar pain that went hand in hand with silent body snatching. It seems like a legend, but it was a profession. Doctors and college students needed to study, and cemeteries became night markets. Men dug up the recently deceased like they were harvesting potatoes. They carried the bodies wrapped in cloths through the silent alleys to rooms where knowledge mixed with discomfort. It was a crime accepted with half-closed eyes. Everyone knew. No one spoke, because even knowledge needed shadows sometimes. And those who stole corpses did what the living did not dare to face. The police were a vague presence, underfunded, poorly trained, easily bribed. Some agents would rather not see. Others saw too much. But most people knew that arresting someone for stealing a loaf of bread was easier than solving the city's real crimes. And so the system balanced itself on its own inefficiency. The fear didn't just come from criminals. It came from neglect, from omission, from a look that passes right by. And London followed, between alleys, furtive hands, and laws written in charcoal. And even in the midst of all this, there was a strange ethic, an invisible code among those who survived on the edge. They shared what little they had. They protected those who were from the same corner. There were rules among those who lived on the margin, and these rules were often more respected than those imposed by those in power. Crime, in that context, was also a portrait, not of evil, but of desperation. And listening to these stories calmly helps us realize that, behind every crime, there may be a question. What would you do to stay alive? Night in Victorian London was not an invitation to rest. It was a whisper of warning. When the sun disappeared behind the factories and the last reflections trickled down the wet rooftops, the city took on a different face. The streets, once bustling, became empty corridors where the sound of one's own footsteps seemed louder than it should have been. The gas lamps cast a weak, flickering light, as if hesitant to illuminate certain corners. And in the dark alleys, eyes watched unhurriedly. There was no lantern, no headlight, no security. Only the night, alive and unpredictable. Walking after dark was, for many, an exercise in faith. The wagons were getting smaller, but the dangers were getting bigger. Groups gathered on street corners, some laughing, others just waiting. It was hard to tell who was a threat, who was just another face trying to get home. The shadows were getting longer on the walls of the taverns, and the sounds were changing. The clink of bottles, a muffled scream, the cry of a baby who couldn't tell the difference between fear and hunger. The night was a minefield of silence. Inside the houses, there was no complete peace either. The doors were closed with improvised locks. The rats, who were bolder, came out of their hiding places and crossed the rooms with the confidence of those who know every corner. Through the thin walls, everything could be heard. The neighbors' fights, the creaking of the beds, the footsteps upstairs, the sobs in the dark. And yet, there was a collective effort to appear calm, as if pretending to be normal was a way of escaping reality. Fires were a constant fear. The nearby buildings, the flammable materials, the candles that wouldn't go out. One mistake, and everything turned to grey. The sound of sirens was rare. Fighting the fire involved bucket, shouting and running. Often, saving meant just pulling out a blanket before the flames consumed the rest. And yet, many returned to sleep among the rubble, because there was no choice, and because, in the absence of everything, sleep was still an escape. Children were sometimes left alone. Their fathers went out to work at night. Their mothers went out to sell whatever they could, and they, little shadows, huddled in the corners of their rooms. They waited for the day with wide eyes. They learned early on that darkness was not just the absence of light, but the presence of everything the world hid. Some played with rag dolls, others just counted the time, listening to the sounds of the street as if they were the hands of a clock. And even in the fear, there was resistance. A warm cup of tea by the bed, a story told softly, even if made up, a long look before blowing out the candle, small nocturnal rituals that, in some way, protected what could still be protected. And when sleep finally came, it came heavy, not from rest, but from exhaustion. It was the body shutting down, because it no longer had the strength, and the city outside continued on. Today, when you turn on a light with a simple touch, you might remember those nights, not as something distant, but as an echo. The darkness of that London was not just the absence of light bulbs. It was the presence of courage, of care, of love in the smallest things. It was a long night, but full of souls that refused to be extinguished. And that is what still shines, even in the streets where history has turned to dust. Amid the constant gloom and the weariness that trickled down the alleys, life in Victorian London found silent ways to continue. Survival was not just physical, it was emotional, it was everyday. It emerged in small gestures, in the minimal choices that resisted collapse. Sharing a piece of bread with a neighbor who had gone without, warming one's hands around a candle, even though one knew the flame would last only a short time. Sharing laughter in a smoky tavern, where music stumbled between laughter and glasses. These moments, so fragile, sustained a stubborn humanity. Among the residents of the poorest neighborhood, there was an invisible code of solidarity. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew it. When everything is lacking, the other is all you have. Women left pots and pans on windowsills for hungry neighbors to help themselves too. Children took care of each other, creating games amidst the rubble. Men exchanged hours of work for feathers, for help, for silence. And in this frayed fabric, between stitches of pain and hope, a network was formed that supported much more than bodies. It supported souls. There was music, sometimes coming from an out-of-tune violin played on the street corner. Other times, just whistles that snaked through the air as if they wanted to distract the night. There were also love letters, scribbled on scraps of old paper, hidden among mattresses and dirty clothes. And there were promises of a better future, of a new job, of a city where one could breathe. Even without knowing how to read, many dreamed of words, and those who knew how to write wrote for two, because the role there was also a place of escape. Love existed. It wasn't always romantic, it wasn't always easy, but it was present in the hands that tended to wounds, in the eyes that waited for someone to come back through the door, in the silent wait that went on night after night. Couples shared thin mattresses and heavy stories. Siblings protected themselves from rats and the cold with blankets that didn't cover everything, but covered enough. Touch, even rough, was often the only true shelter. And in this tough, real love, there was a strength that not even the city could extinguish. Time was a slow enemy. Each day seemed the same, but each day demanded more. Still, people carried on. Some planted flowers in tin pots. Others read battered Bibles with eyes of curiosity and faith. There were those who collected bottle caps, those who counted stars, those who wrote diaries in torn notebooks. These were small acts, but each one was a way of saying, I am still here. I still see beauty. I still hope. And it is from this resilience that the story that is not in the books is built. The story of those who did not have famous names, but who carried in their bodies and memories the weight of a city that did not know how to rest. They turned pain into routine, and routine into resistance. Not with great revolution, but with small persistences. And perhaps that is the true power of the past, reminding us that, even in the worst condition, humans still find a way to be human. Now that we've come back from that dusty time, perhaps you'll realize that Victorian London was more than just a dark setting. It was a mirror of how we carry on even when everything around us seems to stand still. And if this story touched you, well, there's plenty more where that came from. I'll be here, as always,